What's up everybody? Welcome to a brand new demonstration. I've been asked by the Bonsaikunst Hamburg in Germany to put together this demonstration for you guys. They are putting on another online kind of digital exhibition this year. And just like last year, they've asked me to demo a tree here at Eisei-en. So I've selected out this juniper here planted on a lace rock. And I want to kind of take you through the design process on the tree and explain how to work with a plant that doesn't necessarily have ideal foliage, but that we can still create a pretty interesting and unique bonsai with. So I am not 100% sure as to exactly what species of juniper this is. It has kind of prostrata-like foliage, but it's a little bit leggy compared to a normal prostrata. So it could be a cultivar of prostrata or something, similar or related to that particular cultivar. But in any case, it is quite leggy. The foliage runs and elongates rather than balls up. So it's a little bit difficult to create pads on a tree like this. But like I said, I want to kind of take you through that process. Now, as you can see, I've done a little bit of work on the tree already, so I want to walk you through what's been done to the plant prior to this demonstration. So a little over a year ago, I planted it in this lace rock in the spring. We let it grow unimpeded all last year because it was pretty aggressive root work at that time. This year in the spring, again, we let it flush out. We've been fertilizing it relatively heavily using something called Grow Power here in the US, which is a 12-8-8 organic cake fertilizer. So it's put on a tremendous amount of growth. You can see up at the top of the tree, we've got elongating growth. It's full of berries. It's a very healthy tree, so it's in a good state to actually style up. Now, prior to this demonstration, I started working on the deadwood. I utilized a number of tools to prepare the deadwood. So first and foremost, I went through and broke back all of the elongating gins or deadwood branches on the tree. So most of these had been flat cut in prior years as they had died off, so they hadn't really been worked back. So I typically use a concave cutter or a flat branch splitter to peel away at each of those gins to create some taper in them. And it's not that I want all of them to come to an exact point, but I do want kind of a jagged, naturalistic, tapered look to each of those. Now, if you go out in nature and look at gins on trees or dead branches on trees, you will notice that as the branches break, they tear away from the bottom. So I typically grab on the underside and pull away so that most of that tearing and striated look is on the underside of the branch. Again, it gives it a much more naturalistic look, in my opinion. I also utilized some scraping tools as well to remove the old bark that was on some of those gins that had died off in prior years. If you're working with deadwood on a juniper or really any coniferous piece of material, if you don't remove that bark right after the branch dies, it becomes very difficult to remove with standard tools like a gin plier, for example. So you're going to have to utilize something like a scraping tool to remove that wood. Now, when you do that, you end up with a very unnatural look to the tree. You can tell that it has been worked by hand. So what we want to do to adjust for that and correct for that is take a blowtorch and actually blowtorch each of those gins and some of the shari or deadwood on the trunk to create a much more sort of blended look with the old natural deadwood that was already on the tree. So we char this with a blowtorch. It could be a butane or a propane torch, but we want to bring out kind of that alligator skin texture to the wood. And then once we've done that, we're going to go back through with a wire brush and actually brush a majority of that off. This is actually going to blend everything together, again, that new wood with the old wood, so that it looks very naturalistic and it looks like something that came out of the mountains as a yamadori or a collected tree. In addition to that, to get a really nice contrast between the live vein and the deadwood, I've cleaned up the live vein using a razor blade or an X-Acto knife, or in this case a box cutter actually, to peel away at the outer layer of bark. And then we take either sandpaper or a wire brush or perhaps even a Dremel tool and run over the live vein with that. And that really brings out the nice bright red or brown characteristics of the live tissue. So of course that live tissue is what's connected from the living roots up to the foliage at the top of the tree. It's what's feeding the portion of the plant at the top and keeping it alive. So you want to be extra careful, particularly when you're using something like a Dremel tool. I use a sandpaper head and I turn it down to a relatively low RPM and I don't push very hard on that live tissue. We're really just taking the outer layer of bark off. We don't want to get down to the phloem underneath. So if you start exposing some of that kind of yellowy or green type tissue below the bark, you've gone a little bit too far. So you want to back off a little bit. Now it's okay if you expose a little bit of that tissue, it will heal back over. But if you do too much of it all over the tree all at once, you could potentially weaken the plant. So just be extra careful, particularly again if you're using a Dremel tool. Now the next step was to take this tree outside, wash the deadwood with water and a toothbrush, really cleaning it up, and then paint it with lime sulfur. So I use a mix of basically 50% water, 50% lime sulfur, and paint it on the deadwood features of the tree, and they turn bright white. So as you can see here, the tree is fully prepared and ready to actually style up and wire. Okay, so before we actually style this tree up, I want to answer a question that was submitted to me by the Bonsaikunst Hamburg. Now, throughout this demonstration, I'm going to answer a number of these questions. They're not related to this tree necessarily, but they're questions that the organization thought that you guys as an audience might be interested in learning about. So we're going to dot these about the demonstration today. So the first question is, besides Chinese quince or Pseudocydonia, are there more species on which susoba leaves occur? So just to give you an understanding of what a susoba is a Japanese term. It refers to the very first leaf on a shoot on a broadleaf evergreen or deciduous tree. Now typically that very first leaf is smaller than the rest of the leaves on that shoot, and it happens to be misshapen in general compared to the rest of those leaves as well. At the base of that particular leaf, the susoba, there is no bud, so there's no dormant bud there. So that very first leaf, when we're cutting back on our broadleaf evergreen and deciduous trees, we actually don't count that in our leaf count. So typically we're cutting back from 6 to 8 leaf long shoots back to about 2 leaves, but you want to subtract that susoba out and you don't count it in that 2 leaf count. So technically you're actually leaving typically 3 leaves if you include the susoba. Now, because the susoba doesn't have a bud, if you were to cut back to that susoba, it's not likely to flush out again and produce a new shoot. So that's why we want to leave at least 1 or 2 leaves beyond that with a dormant bud at the base. So there are a lot of species that have susoba on them. For example, as I mentioned, Pseudocydonia or Chinese quince. There's also Stewardia, flowering apricot. Quite often beech and hornbeam will sometimes have susoba as well. But the most common ones that I work with here at Eisei-en are going to be Stewardia, flowering apricot, and of course the Pseudocydonia. All right, so when I'm wiring a tree like this, I try to start as close to the trunk as possible, working on the primary branches first with the thickest wire, going past my secondary branches, and then eventually going back to those secondary branches and working my way further out towards the tertiary branches. So you can see right here, we've got the first real bifurcation or split in this branch. So I've got a size 8 wire that goes on several wraps past this first bifurcation. That allows me then to use those additional wraps here as the anchor for my secondary branches. So I'm going to go down with a smaller size wire here. We're going to butt it up against the original wire, and then I'm going to take this out on the branch, anchoring this secondary branch with one that's a little bit further down on the main branch here. Now, when you do this, you want to make sure that you're anchoring onto the main branch first with the wire that's already there, because if you were to put this wire onto this branch here first and then go to wire this, this is likely to kind of rotate and twist and potentially snap off. So you definitely want to make sure you've got your anchor set up first here. All right, now that the anchor is set up, we can go back to the secondary branch and take this wire out. Now, these branches are very, very flexible here. So the wire I'm putting on, I'm actually stretching the pitch out quite heavily. If this were a tree that were much more brittle than this and likely to break, I'd make this pitch more of like a 45-degree angle, for example. But on this particular tree, I'm really stretching it out because it looks better and it also uses less wire as well. So from an economic perspective, it makes more sense in saving a little bit of money using less wire. All right, so let's take a look at the foliage out here at the end of the branch. Now, when you're working with really leggy foliage like this, it's really hard to detail every single little individual piece of foliage on here to get it in the proper place. As a matter of fact, you're going to end up breaking most of that off and it ends up looking really, really messy. So there are a couple of ways you can treat foliage like this. One would be, if you've got a lot of foliage on the bottom and a lot of foliage on the top, you could rotate the branch one direction or the other so that all of that vertically oriented foliage becomes horizontal or kind of flat when we lay it down. The other option is to remove just the foliage on the underside and leave the foliage on the top. That's going to give you lots of volume on the top of the branch, and then you can create a really nice flat pad on the bottom. Now, which way you go is going to be dependent on how much foliage is already on that branch. So in other words, if you have a pretty sparse branch that is relatively weak compared to other portions of the tree, you might want to go with the first option, meaning rotating it so you keep a majority of that foliage. But in the case of this particular branch here, it's actually relatively strong and it's got a lot of foliage on it. So I'm going to take the secondary option. I think it's going to look a lot cleaner and be a lot easier to style. So in that case, we're going to strip basically all of this foliage off the bottom. So you can do this by pulling it by hand if you want, or you can scissor cut it. Either way is fine. If it's really hard to pull by hand, obviously scissor cutting is probably going to be a better option. And then once we get out here to the very end, what I like to do is kind of loop my finger underneath and see kind of what that's going to look like once we loop the wire out here at the end. If I feel like it's going to be too full or too dense, I might take a little bit more foliage off. If I feel like it's just right, we may leave all of that on there. So I tend to leave a majority to begin with, wire it up, and then set everything. If I feel like it's too dense, we can then go back and remove a little bit more off the underside. So same situation here. We've got a lot of stuff dangling on the bottom. So I'll go ahead and remove all of that. We'll take this off as well here and here. All right, and when we drop that down, loop underneath, it's going to give us a really nice look. Another thing I recommend that you do is leave all of the tip growth intact for right now. Once we wire it and set it, we can then cut this back to the proper length, because sometimes we want these branches to actually elongate and grow out into a new position. So we want to have that option available to us. All right, so now that we've kind of thinned out this branch, I'm going to go through and actually detail this up. And when I say detail, really we're just wiring the lignified branches here. So it's not going to require a ton of detail necessarily. So, I think people get a little bit confused when we talk about, detailing up a tree. You don't have to wire each individual branch. You want to make strategic decisions about which branches and foliage to remove first to make the whole process much easier for you. All right, so while I'm working on this lowest branch right here, I'll answer the second question from the Bonsaikunst Hamburg, and that is, what can we do to prevent pests and diseases in order to need as little chemicals as possible? So for me personally here at Eisei-en, we spray proactively with some pretty heavy duty chemicals like malathion, for example, for pests, and maybe Cleary's 3336 or Infuse, for example, as a systemic for diseases. And we spray preventively with those things to make sure that we don't have issues. We have a lot of plants here, quite often they're relatively expensive plants, or they're plants that we're maintaining for clients as well. So it scares the living daylights out of me not to be proactive. I don't want to sit around and wait for something to appear in the garden and then treat it retroactively. So we have a pretty strict schedule here for spraying. Typically once a month we're spraying with at least a fungicide and or a pesticide. And then in the spring and fall, when you see a majority of the diseases and a lot of pests starting to emerge, but particularly diseases at those times of the year, we're spraying multiple times in a month with certain chemicals as well. Now that being said, I know that you guys from the Bonsaikunst Hamburg in Germany, you're probably not going to have access to a lot of the chemicals that we have access to here in the States due to the laws that are there. And in other parts of Europe, you're probably going to run into the same issues as well. So, find what you can in your area to spray proactively. But aside from that, really the main thing you want to make sure you're doing is keeping your trees very healthy. A weaker tree invites pests and it invites diseases in. So if you can make sure that you're being proactive about fertilizing your trees, making sure that they're very healthy, using macronutrients and micronutrients as well. For example, using fertilizer cakes that are well balanced as an organic sort of macronutrient base, and then supplementing with a micronutrient like a liquid kelp, for example, that's going to contain zinc and iron, molybdenum, copper, all of those good things for your trees. That's going to be very beneficial. Making sure that you're pruning your trees at the right time as well. I know a lot of people in the spring, as a new growth comes out, they just want to start cutting back. That's a terrible thing to do. You want to let your trees really flush out in the spring so that you get a good hormonal interaction happening within the plant. That's also going to strengthen the plant, produce more roots and more subsequent top growth on your trees. And then the trees will be much healthier going into the growing season, and they're going to be less susceptible to attacks from pests and diseases. But again, in my opinion, if you can find some heavy-duty chemicals, some concentrated chemicals that are legal in your area, I would proactively spray your bonsai with those. All right, so while I'm working on this tree here, I'm going to go ahead and answer several of the other questions that were submitted by the Bonsaikunst Hamburg. So the third question here is, how can you tell when you can/should defoliate a broadleaf tree, either partially or totally? So there are a number of species that are okay to do partial outer canopy defoliation on, and a number of species that I would avoid it on. Now we've kind of figured out what these species are based on experimentation over the years, and of course most of this experimentation was done in Japan. Now coming back to the United States, I'm working with a lot of our native species here, so I'm having to experiment with those different species here to see how they respond to partial outer canopy defoliation. And when I say POCD or partial outer canopy defoliation, what I'm referring to is removing 80 to 90% of the outer extremity of the canopy of the tree, all the way down to the lowest branches as well, and leaving the internal growth completely alone. This allows light to penetrate to the interior while the exterior flushes out again, and you get more ramification as well as energy balance on the tree. So, in your particular area in Europe or in Australia or wherever you happen to be watching this, you want to make sure that you're experimenting, maybe find a young piece of material, test out the partial outer canopy defoliation technique on it, see if it reliably and consistently puts out a second flush of growth that is equal in size across the whole tree. It could be smaller than the first flush of growth, that's fine, but you don't want large leaves in certain areas, small leaves in other areas, and dieback in other areas. That would be an indication that that's a species that's not really good for POCD. The next question here actually ties in with the last question, and that is, on which species should defoliation not be done? Well, from my experience, hornbeams don't respond very well, beech don't respond very well. Most Japanese maples, standard Acer palmatum and the dwarf cultivars, for example, don't respond very well to POCD. So I would avoid it on those species. Now, that doesn't mean you can't ever do POCD on those species, but they don't reliably put out a second flush of growth, and you will end up with energy balance distribution issues across the tree. Like I just mentioned, certain areas you might get dieback, certain areas you might get overly large leaves. So if you're running into a situation where it is, say, a hornbeam, for example, that is very long in terms of its internodes and the leaves are very large and it looks very healthy, maybe every other year or every 3 or 4 years, maybe you can do a POCD application to that particular tree, but I wouldn't do it year after year after year. Species that respond well to POCD are going to be like flowering apricot, for example, particularly if they're younger trees, Stewardia, Elaeagnus or silverberry, and of course trident maple as well. The fifth question here also ties into defoliation, and that is, does it make sense to defoliate fruit trees? I don't really recommend that you defoliate your fruit trees. Fruit trees tend to be quite susceptible to diseases, and that secondary flush of leaves, if you do defoliate, tends to be a little bit weaker and more susceptible to infestation from fungal issues. So I would avoid defoliating really any of your fruiting trees. All right, so the next question here is, which measures help bonsai trees best to cope with intense heat? So just to give you kind of a frame of reference, here in Nashville, where our nursery, Eisei-en, is located, the highest summer temperatures are going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 96, 97, maybe 98 degrees, and that's Fahrenheit, of course. So Celsius, that's going to be probably 36 to 39 degrees, so quite hot. So in the hottest part of the summer, really starting in June, going through basically mid to late September, we have a majority of our trees under 30% or 40% shade cloth. So the best case scenario would be to actually have retractable shade cloth, so you can pull that shade cloth back in the evening so that the wind and the trees can kind of breathe in that environment, and then in the hottest part of the day, pull the shade cloth back out to cover the trees up. If you don't have that option, I would do most of your trees in morning sun, and then afternoon shade is typically best, so they're protected in the hottest part of the day. So if you've got a big tree in your yard, you can position your bonsai in a way that they get that type of sun and shade throughout the day. Another option would be, if it's a species where the foliage really isn't that susceptible to burn, but the roots heating up could cause dieback on the plant. Like for example, here in the States, we have ponderosa pines. They really don't like to have the roots heat up quite a lot. So if you don't have a shade environment or shade cloth that you can put up, you can wrap the pots in a white cloth during the day to reflect the sunlight. So the next question here is, do you treat your trees in Tennessee all the same way you have learned in Japan, or are there things you do differently at home now? So a vast majority of the species that I work with here have similar sort of counterparts in Japan. So, our Rocky Mountain junipers here, at least in terms of the trunk characteristics, are very similar to, say, Itoigawa, for example, in Japan, although the foliage is quite different. We have parallels with pines as well. We've got the limber pine here in the States, which is nearly identical, in my opinion, to the Japanese white pine. So the actual techniques that we're applying to those trees here to produce back budding, to produce ramification, for example, to expedite growth, is basically identical to what I learned in Japan. And that's one of the reasons actually why we picked Nashville as our base location here for the nursery, because the climate is nearly identical to Osaka, where I studied in Japan. Now, of course, there are some species, like I mentioned earlier, that we need to experiment a little bit more with. So like our American hornbeam, for example, I'm still not fully convinced that it's a great species to defoliate. So we're working on experimenting with those, hop hornbeam as well, taxodium here in the States. You don't really see a parallel to that in Japan, so it's not something that obviously I trained and learned about while I was there. So we're having to experiment with those, but a vast majority of the species, even if it's a native US species, has a parallel to a species in Japan, and the techniques are essentially the same. All right, next question here is it possible that Princess Persimmon and pomegranate, which have produced flowers and fruit when they were newly imported from Japan, do not flower later because of a slightly colder climate, for example, in northern Germany? What other reasons might be possible? So yeah, this is definitely a possibility. In northern Germany, your temperatures are going to be quite a bit cooler than they would be in Japan, and particularly Honshu, where most of the plants of those species are actually going to originate. I don't know about humidity in your area either, but in most of Honshu, it's going to be quite humid for a good portion of the growing season. So that could also have an effect on the plants too. It could also be a bit of stress in the first couple of years after the plants are imported from Japan, although I do know that plants being imported into Europe don't have to be bare rooted like they do when they come to the States. So you're not going to have to worry too much about them becoming extremely weak like they would if they were coming to the US. In addition to that, possibly the way that the plants are being pruned could be an issue as well. If they're being pruned too early in the season and not allowed to flower, for example, they're not going to produce fruit subsequently in the fall. Another thing to consider is the fertilizer that you're using. You may want to use something that has a higher phosphorus fertilizer to produce more flowers on the plant, and again, subsequent fruiting in the fall. So there could be any number of variables, but I would try adjusting all of those and see what you can come up with. All right, next question here is what can cause an old Shinpaku juniper, which is a well cared for bonsai in a pot for decades, to lose some twigs and branches each year in the summer without any pests or diseases on the tree? What can be done to solve the problem? All right, so that internal yellowing of foliage on your junipers in the first part of the summer is what's called toya in Japanese, T-O-Y-A, and it's a natural shedding process of junipers. So junipers are going to shed unnecessary foliage on the internal portion of the tree in favor of the external canopy of the tree. And they do that because they're over transpiring if they retain all of that foliage, and that could cause desiccation or dieback. So the tree is actually selecting out internal weaker growth, shedding that growth, and then you're going to get elongating extension growth on the external canopy. So in order to offset that, what you may want to do is a little bit earlier in the spring season. So for us here, our spring starts in March. Usually sometime in April or May, I'll do a little bit of a thinning out or a cleanup on some of our junipers, removing underside foliage, for example, crotch growth, cutting off unnecessary branches that don't need to be a part of the design of the tree. And then that will offset the amount of foliage that the tree will naturally shed itself when the temperatures start rising in June. So this year, actually in the States, all over the United States, I've been talking to bonsai professionals and also bonsai hobbyists, and it seems that a lot of people have had problems with excess dieback of internal foliage on their junipers this year, more so than in previous years. And I think that that might have something to do with the very long, cool, wet spring that we had this year. It was a bit strange in that regard, and really all over the United States we saw this. So I think that a lot of trees may actually have been affected by that and fungal issues subsequent to that, and that's why they dropped excessive amounts of internal foliage. But just on a yearly basis, you will notice some of that internal growth shedding off, but again, you can offset that by thinning the tree out just a little bit earlier in the spring season. All right, and then the final question here, this is a fun one. It says, what did you like best in Japan and what was most difficult for you during your apprenticeship at Eisei-en? So I would say probably the thing that I enjoyed the most in Japan was actually the city of Kyoto, which sounds kind of strange, but it's the city itself that I fell in love with, and one of the reasons that I wanted to go back to Japan and spend, eventually 9 years there. Now, of course, I didn't live in Kyoto for a majority of my apprenticeship. I did live there for about 2 years and commuted down to Osaka to do my apprenticeship. But for me, just being near that city, it was only an hour away by train from Osaka where I was living. It really, drew me to Japan, drew me in, all the temples and the gardens and just the beauty and the history there, the mix of modern and very old all in one city was really inspirational. And it's something that I still draw inspiration from in building my nursery here, setting stones, for example, the display area of the garden as well. All of that, I kind of take the aesthetics and ideas of these gardens in Japan and specific in Kyoto and apply them here to my nursery. Now, to answer the second half of that question, what was the most difficult part during my apprenticeship at Kokain? I would say probably, at least for the first couple of years, it was the sort of marathon aspect of doing an apprenticeship. It was, sun up to sundown, 7 days a week. Maybe you'd get a day off every month. Maybe it'd be 2 or 3 months before you had a day off. But it was, always being there at the nursery at Fujikawa-san's beck and call. Whatever he said, I had to do as an apprentice. And that's a difficult situation to move into coming from the United States, where it's kind of a free-for-all here. It's every man for himself, and it's very individualistic here in the United States. Going into almost like a militaristic kind of environment like that was difficult to adjust to at the beginning. But by the 3rd and 4th year as an apprentice, you kind of just roll with things, and then it becomes part of who you are and just sort of your general situation. So by the time I finished my apprenticeship, of course I wanted to stay on longer at the nursery because I loved it so much, and that's why I ended up staying an additional 3 years after I graduated. All right, so this is our juniper bonsai after I finished styling up the tree here. So I want to go through kind of my design decisions on the tree so you have an understanding of what I did. Now, of course, this tree is leaning very heavily to the left. So we have a nice counterbalance branch here on the bottom right side of the tree that's quite low and pulled in towards the trunk. But our actual directional branch on the left side of the tree, we actually have kind of 2 directional branches, both of which are cascading down the side. So we've got this guy in the front and this one a little bit further to the back side here that's actually a little further out on the left side. I wanted to take those branches in and then back out to give kind of an elegant look to the tree. I also wanted to cut across the front of the trunk with one of these branches here to pull foliage into that area to break up the visual line of the trunk as well. So, having the whole trunk bare all the way from the bottom to the top is really not an ideal situation. That being said, when you are designing most of your bonsai, typically you're not going to have this extreme of a cut across the trunk, particularly this low on the tree. Usually this isn't going to happen until you get maybe 2/3 of the way up the tree, and then we really start covering a majority of the trunk from there up. But in the case of this tree, pulling those bottom branches in to create that elegant feel, I felt that it made more sense to go ahead and cut across the trunk there to break up that line at the base. That also helps frame this really interesting part of the tree down here, where you've got the live vein intertwining with the interesting deadwood features. Now, up at the top of the tree here, I took the branch from the back. We actually had that really tall branch at the top. I cut that off, made a small jin on the back side here. And then the lower branches here, I brought those around, whipped it around to create the apex in the front. Now the apex looks a little bit strange at this point, I understand that, but eventually as it fills in, this is going to kind of round out up here. We'll elongate some of this on this side so it looks a little bit better, and then it'll make a bit more sense, I think, at that point. But this is kind of standard when I'm setting up an apex on a juniper like this. Typically we end up having just very long kind of leggy branches at the top that have to be finagled around. So I also wanted to drop the apex down quite low so that we could get the tenjin or the apical jins here, the deadwood, sticking out beyond the height of the foliage. To me, this adds a sense of, age to the tree, for example. It makes it feel like the tree's been compressed by snow or by the elements, have been battered down, and it can't get any taller than what we have it right here. So it kind of adds to the general story of the tree. So I know this was kind of an unconventional way to do a demonstration. Usually I'd explain like every little detail as we go, but I thought this would be more interesting to answer some questions from the folks at the Bonsaikunst Hamburg, and I hope you guys enjoyed my answers. So make sure to like this video, share it all around, and go support the Bonsaikunst Hamburg. Go check out their online digital exhibition. I want to thank everybody from the organization for asking me to do this demonstration, and I look forward to seeing all of you guys in person in the near future.